All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Documenting and Preserving Michigan's Coastal Resources. We're really excited to have you here today in this conversation. Right. Today, we are using Zoom software, and so just a few housekeeping things so we can orient you to the software so you can have the most out of your webinar experiences. We have a Q&A box to ask questions. That's where you should refer all your questions to. It'll be two little chat boxes in your toolbar if you wiggle your mouse. So you can type in your question whenever it pops into your head, and we will be saving questions until the end of our webinar. But that is available to you at any time. There is a chat function, but we would prefer to have all questions in the Q&A so we don't lose track of them. Any resources that are shared during the webinar will be shared through the chat box. So do keep a tab on that and check out the conversation that may be happening there. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out a link to anyone who registered if they were unable to join, or if you want to revisit this webinar at another time. And these webinars are also being posted to our YouTube channel. So even if someone was unaware that this webinar was happening, they can go to our YouTube channel and check out those past webinars and view as many times as they want at their leisure. So thank you again for joining us today, and we really hope that you enjoy this webinar. So today we're going to be talking about documenting and preserving Michigan's coastal resources. We are so fortunate to live in a state that is surrounded by water and a lot of lakeshore, which is great for tourism and relaxing, and it also really contributed to our state's past. And with the fluctuating water levels, though, they're currently on the higher end of documented lake levels. The water flow has altered our coastlines, which has caused erosion and is exposing historic resources previously buried and threatens structures built close to the lakes. So today we are joined by Wayne Luscardi, who is our state maritime archaeologist for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and Chuck Clark, who is the treasurer of the Friends of Point Betsy Lighthouse. So we're really excited to have them both here today. Briefly about our organization, the Michigan Historic Preservation Network advocates for Michigan's historic places that contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We are the statewide nonprofit, and we rely on members to make our work possible. So if you would like to join us, please visit our website at www.mhpn.org and check out the resources and programming that we offer, and check out our membership as well if you would like to join us. Thank you if you are already a member and support us. We really appreciate you. Additionally, these webinars are supported through a grant by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs, so we want to thank them as well. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Wayne.
All right, thank you, Mallory. Let me see, get my screen shared here. All right, are we on my first page?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So today I'm going to talk to you about a project that has been ongoing for different reasons, and that is the documentation of potential beach wreckage or ship wreckage that has come ashore over the years. That's all over the state of Michigan. And sometimes it's big sections of wreck, and sometimes it's an individual plank or a piece of coal, but it's all human-made materials. It's all cultural materials that we're very interested in recording. And we developed a process to do that more systematically than just kind of calling in and taking a quick snapshot. And so I'm going to talk to you about that today. So this really, the initiative for beach wreckage survey in Michigan started in 2013. And it started for quite the opposite reason that we're dealing with today. And that is the water levels were incredibly low 7 years ago. And consequently, things like pieces and parts of shipwrecks and old docks and structures with pilings and wharves and piers that had been underwater were now, because of the low water levels, suddenly exposed. And there were great amounts of materials that were being viewed by the public all over the state of Michigan. And so I kind of developed this program to use citizen scientists, that is, non-trained, non-professional people that are just beachgoers, essentially, to go out and record very systematically some of the materials that might be in front of their house or at their favorite state park or somewhere exposed along the shorelines. We have to remember that the lakes are very dynamic, obviously, and that what you see today, you may not see tomorrow. And so you really only have a brief window of opportunity to go out and record these materials. A plank that's laying on the beach today could be buried in sand tomorrow. It could be washed back out into the lake. And maybe you can find that same plank a mile down the shore next week after a storm, that sort of thing. So again, it's just a very brief window of opportunity. Fast forward 7 years to what we're dealing with today. Now we have near record high water levels all over the Great Lakes, and the opposite is happening. Now the beaches they're not being exposed, they're being eroded. And things like shipwrecks that were buried underneath the beaches, or they were in the near shore environment and thrown up on the beaches, are suddenly being exposed for the first time since they wrecked in some cases. And very occasionally, you might find, again, just individual components, but sometimes, like we saw this last winter, entire shipwrecks are being exposed on the beaches, like down around Ludington and Muskegon. And very often when you're walking out in front of your home or your cottage or your favorite state park or national seashore, you might find something like this laying on the beach. The key to all of this recording is that you don't have to know exactly what it is. You just have to suspect that it's a historic resource, that it's part of a shipwreck perhaps, and that it's worthy of reporting it to somebody. And so what you want to do is you don't have to, again, identify or be able to identify every component, but you do want to systematically record it. So sometimes you'll see a collection like this. More often you'll see an individual piece of something that looks pretty old, that looks like it probably came from a shipwreck, like the frames here that are ashore on the Lake Huron side of the lake. And then the lower slide here, you can see an actual fish tug rudder. So sometimes, again, they might be very readily identifiable, and other times they're usually not. But you suspect that they might come from a wreck, and you really want to record them. Occasionally, like we said, you might see an entire shipwreck or a very large component of that shipwreck that's on the beach somewhere. This is the Joseph Fay. It was a bulk freighter built in the 1870s, and it went ashore at 40 Mile Point Lighthouse north of Rogers City in 1905. And about half of one side of the Fay has been sitting in the same spot on the beach there since 1905. Now, this picture was taken just a couple of summers ago on the right-hand side, and you can see the dynamics of the lake and the high water levels have really impacted the Joseph Fay site. And so if you can imagine that these small individual objects are going to be moving about because of waves and ice action throughout the winter and currents and other things, even very large pieces of shipwrecks are being impacted. So you have about a 140-foot section of this bulk freighter that was sitting in the same place up until just a couple of summers ago. And all of a sudden, this last winter, it was picked up, shoved up into the tree line, and moved down the beach considerably. So it's being highly impacted. And consequently, you have to really get out there and record this stuff, because you don't know what's going to happen to it tomorrow. It might be underneath the sand dunes tomorrow, it might be pulled back out into the lake. So if you have the opportunity now, it's a beautiful day out, go outside and try to record these things so that we can save the information from them. So how do you go about doing a beach survey? Well, sometimes it's just as simple as getting outside and walking the beaches and just kind of looking around. We're just doing a visual survey. We're not metal detecting, we're not digging things up, we're not picking stuff up and bringing it in or turning it into somewhere or keeping it ourselves. We're just walking the beaches and just keeping our eyes open and seeing what we see. And if you see a piece of wood or an old nail or a pile of coal or something like that, and you suspect that humans made it and that it perhaps came from a shipwreck or from an old historic structure, then it's worthy of some kind of documentation and recording. And so the simple things, the toolkit for this process is they're pretty simple. You carry a backpack, so you might have the stuff that you need in it. A handheld GPS is absolutely essential for recording the locations of the pieces and parts. And very often a part might move down the beach in great distances sometimes. And if we carefully record those materials, we can see how it kind of moves and interacts with the natural environment. A digital camera is also a must. We want to get photographs of what it looks like in its current state. And again, we're just looking at a snapshot in time. So I made this list in 2013, 7 years ago, and now most people, or a lot of people, have smartphones, and it doubles as both a GPS unit and a digital camera. So you don't have to worry about getting a professionally made GPS unit. You can just go ahead and use the GPS location app that's already on your smartphone. Bring a photo scale with you. It's very important. If you look in the lower left, there's a boiler grate bar from an old steamship. It would be very difficult without a photo bar in that to guess whether that object is 2 inches long or 2 feet long. We have no idea. So it's really good to put it into some kind of context with a scale. If you don't have a scale, you'll probably be carrying a tape measure anyway. And so you can use that, or you can put some kind of object in the photograph, like a coin, a quarter, or something like that, that's of known size so that we can kind of compare it to that. Bring the survey forms with you. I'm going to talk about them here in a couple of slides. And the survey forms are important to record all of this information very systematically and to make sure that you kind of get as much info out of each object that you can. If you see a collection of objects, you don't have to fill out individual survey forms for all of them unless you're so inclined. More often you can use a single form for a whole group. And you can do these forms, now they're downloadable PDFs, so you can print them and you can record them with a pen or a pencil and a clipboard, or you can just do it all digitally off your phone, for example. And carry a tape measure. Tape measure is probably the most important tool that I use as an archaeologist to record things. If there was a 20-foot plank laying on the beach and you asked 20 people what their guess was to how long that plank was, I guarantee you'll get 20 different answers. And the only right answer is the one that the tape measure tells you it is. And so bring a tape measure along to get very precise measurements on some of these objects. So here's the form. It's available in several places, and I'll show you those links later. But it's a basic preliminary beach wreckage recording form. And so we want to know who's recording the information and when that recording is taking place, because again, things change, and a lot of times multiple people will record the same object, and that's okay. The more information that we get, the better. And so the heading on this is really just the recorder's information. And then there's quite a lot of information regarding the location of that object. We want GPS coordinates if possible. And most people, again, that have smartphones, you can get them right off of that. Or at least we want to know the general vicinity, what lake it's in or what lake shore it's on, whether it's on public or private lands. If it's on private lands and you're going to spend some time transiting, most private lands in the Great Lakes is okay, but you don't want to kind of dally on somebody's private property without their permission. So make sure that you get that, or just stick to public lands and your favorite state parks and that sort of thing. So we want to know exactly who's doing it and where it's located. And then the meat of the form is, what is this object? And again, you don't have to know that it's a second starboard side futtock or anything like that. You really just need to describe it in as great a detail as possible. How long it is, what it's made out of. Are there metal fasteners that are in that component, for example? Is it associated with other stuff nearby? Is it an individual object? Are there known wrecks just offshore? That kind of thing. And then you can supplement this form with additional documentation like photographs and sketches and that sort of stuff. This is the preliminary recording form. So we're not going to assign these objects archaeological site numbers yet, unless they are deemed important enough or stationary enough to do so. And so the next step would be to fill out a Michigan archaeological site form. And this is something we don't worry about right now, but for an individual component like a nail or a plank, it may not be there again tomorrow. It may get washed out or get buried again. And so we don't really want to go through this whole process for something like that. If it's a sophisticated more complex structure or a more permanent fixed position on something, then we want to kind of take it to this next step and record the entire archaeological site form for this. And this can be found on the State Historic Preservation's website above. So when you come across something like a plank or a piece of shipwreck, one of the first things you want to do is record exactly where it is. So you put your GPS down, you wait for good satellite fixes, and you get the numbers. You can record that into the form. And then you want to take just basic measurements, nothing super fancy. You don't have to go really crazy here, but you want to get an overall length, you want to get an overall width and depth, you know, that sort of thing. And then describe it. This is, you know, an 18.5-foot long plank, and it consists, it looks like it's made out of white oak or maybe pine, and it has metal fasteners every 2 feet along one edge, you know, that sort of thing. And again, the more detail, the better, but you don't have to go into the intricacies of every millimeter of this. And then in the right-hand side, you'll see that there are multiple components that are sitting on the beach there. So you can record them individually, or you could record them all as a group feature. And this, a lot of times this is done better, and it's more fun to do it with a friend. So bring, you know, bring a significant other or a friend. Remember to social distance right now if you're not in the same household. But it's a lot easier to measure, especially longer things, if you have some assistance. And 4 eyes are better than 2 as far as seeing different kinds of details, and you can cover more beach and you can cover more area that way. So it's a great sort of family or a group effort. If you bring a GPS along, and some smartphones are capable of doing this as well, the beauty of that is that you can record your track lines, and that is where you have actually walked down along the beach, and then you could upload this data set to Google Earth pretty easily. And we can see exactly where you walked and the materials that you found along the way. And so this is a great tool to give that precise location information, but it's also a great tool to allow you to conduct a very systematic search. You know where there are gaps, you know where you have been. If you want to go back tomorrow or next weekend, you know where to start on your next leg of the shoreline there. So GPS is really nice, and you can work that into Google Earth or GIS if you have it. So very often you're going to see something like this, and if you take photographs of it, which are pretty essential, it's very difficult sometimes to understand exactly what you're looking at here on the beach. It's partly buried in sand, there's ice and snow on it. You don't want to dig this up, you just want to kind of leave it as it is. But drawings are really good tools for archaeologists and historians, so you can get a better feel for what this object is if you produce a scaled drawing. And I know a lot of people are really afraid of drawing things, but give it a try and see and you might surprise yourself. And ultimately, it's a more useful tool than a photograph because you can accentuate the details that are in this feature. You can show where the nail holes are. You can show the different types of materials, whether it's iron or wood, for example, much better than a photograph can show in a lot of cases. So this happens to be a shaft log from an old steamboat that wrecked near Greenbush in the late 19th century. And again, a photograph of this old scow barge that's on the North Point Reef in ALPENA County. It looks like a pretty daunting kind of, you know, very industrial sort of thing. And so you don't really know even where to begin recording this. You start from a corner and start drawing it. In a photograph, you get an oblique photograph, but it doesn't really give you a good idea of what the overall structure of this is. And so what I like to see very often is a plan view or a cross-sectional kind of detailed drawing of this object. And you can do that very simply with a piece of paper or pencil and a couple of tape measures. So just give it a shot, see what you can do. Shipwrecks, of course, are not the only cultural materials that are along the beaches. There are a lot of materials that are exposed that have been discarded over the years. This is an old lifeboat from the Thunder Bay Island Life-Saving Station that was abandoned in the woods in the 1890s. And it's still out there on the island. It's becoming part of the cedar forest. And it's something, again, that we're interested in knowing the locations of these kinds of historic, not just maritime resources, but all historic and archaeological resources. And so filling out a form for this is absolutely fine. This is a 55-foot Chris craft, the Golden Voyage, that went ashore at Thunder Bay Island in 1994. And we were very fortunate to have a photograph of the ship or this yacht before, during, and after its wrecking process. And though this is not a historic structure per se, it is becoming part of the archaeological record. And if you can imagine being along the shore in the 1860s, there might be modern wreckage all over the beaches or in the near shore environment or on the bottom of the lakes. And nobody was really thinking at that time that they would someday become archaeological resources or recreational destinations. But they do, and the Chris craft is no different. So 100 years from now, an archaeologist or historian or beachgoer may come across some of this wreckage. And if you have it recorded now and you have it recorded 10 years from now and 30 years from now and et cetera, you get a much more complete picture of how this cultural resource has interacted with its environment over those years. And that would be a wonderful timeline to have for all shipwrecks all over the Great Lakes. But unfortunately, we didn't start it that way. So don't be afraid of recording this kinds of materials too. Sometimes these artifacts end up in other places. And so we had the wreck of a paddle wheel in Marine City off of Sturgeon Point in 1880. It was a terrible tragedy, a lot of loss of life. But lighthouses around Michigan, and Michigan's got a lot of them, tend to become collection points for shipwreck artifacts for whatever reason. There's a close association historically between a lighthouse and a shipwreck. Obviously, they were very indirect communications with one another. And so for whatever case, artifacts end up at lighthouses. And this is the Marine City's rudder that is displayed at the Sturgeon Point Lighthouse. That's about 1.5 miles away from where the wreck actually occurred. And it's something that most of these lighthouses are on public property. You can visit them. And they have outdoor displays like this rudder, windlasses, capstans, buoys, and other kinds of things that are perfect kind of learning opportunities to practice your drawing skills, practice your 3D modeling and photographic skills. And again, you're not touching the artifact itself. You're just looking at it, you're just recording it. And so you're taking some measurements, and you can do a scale drawing. You can do really kind of artsy drawings, oblique drawings. You can do photo mosaics or whatever. And it's a great way of documenting. Sometimes a lot of these materials that are collected at lighthouses have never been documented before. And so again, you can use the form for these kinds of materials. And another rudder, this one at the 40 Mile Point Lighthouse. And this one, many, many years ago, had a sign on it that said it was from the boat freighter Joseph Fay that we saw earlier, that big giant chunk of shipwreck at 40 Mile Point on the beach. And clearly this is not the Joseph Fay's rudder for a couple of reasons. One is it's much too small. It's not the right configuration to be that rudder. And two, we know that the actual rudder is on the Joseph Fay, which is right offshore in about 20 feet of water or so, a couple of 100 yards from the lighthouse. But this is probably from a small fish tug. And again, it's a perfect learning, ideal learning kind of situation where you can go there, you can sit there all day in the comfort of the park that it's in, and you can draw it. And you can start to see how it was made and what it was made from. And so now that if you're walking down the beach and you see a strap, for example, that's made of iron that looks similar to this, you might be able to get a better feel for where that strap could have come from a rudder like this, for example. So it's another perfect opportunity to fill out one of these forms and record this artifact as well. So in addition to shipwrecks, we're seeing lots and lots and lots of other kinds of materials that are clearly not shipwreckage. And so this is a line of pilings that are outside of Black River. And pilings usually represent some kind of coastal community structure. And it could have been a dock, it could have been a wharf or pier or something like that. And a lot of times these get pulled out and they get dispersed all over. And a lot of times they are erroneously reported as pirate ship masts for some reason in the Great Lakes. But they're old piles, and again, they are cultural materials as well. And so I don't recommend recording an individual form for every one of those pilings, but use them as a group. And go out there and you can see crib logs, you might see fishnet stakes, you might see old dock structure like what these pilings represent, and record them as well as a feature, not as an individual object. And if you're careful about recording that, and if there are multiple sets, you might see how that all kind of pans out to show a fairly sophisticated waterfront, like what ALPENA looked like in about 140 years ago or so. And each one of those docks and piers had different sets of pilings, and as time changed throughout history, some of those docks were abandoned, other docks were expanded, and you can see the differences in those piling sets and all of those crib sets, and you can start to see how the coastal maritime landscape can change pretty dramatically here in ALPENA, and you can do the same anywhere else on the Great Lakes. So I just want to kind of end the show with going back to where you can find these forums. And so if you email me directly, and my contact information can be included here, or is included on the forms, I can send you those forms. You'll end up submitting them to me so that I can put them in a database and manage them through the state's archaeological site files that are administered through Stacy Trzynski at the SHPO's office. We have at the SHPO's office a direct link to a downloadable PDF, and also at the Michigan History Center. And the forms are also being, they're also available at the Friends of Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, for example, a couple of Facebook groups that deal with maritime history and heritage of the Great Lakes. And so they're becoming more and more readily available. So download the forms, get outside and record some shipwrecks and enjoy it. And I look forward to answering any questions you may have afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wayne. That was really interesting. So we're gonna dive right into Chuck's presentation about the Point Betsy Lighthouse. So not only did we want to talk about, you know, the objects and artifacts along the lakeshore, but some of the built environment, the buildings that are also being impacted by the changing water level. So let's try to get this started for you. All right, Chuck, take it away.
Okay, thank you and good afternoon. I want to start about 20 some years ago, 1998, the Coast Guard, who had owned the light station, Point Betsy Light Station, decided to relinquish it to the Bureau of Land Management because it no longer had use for it or could keep it up, other than keep the light is still active, so they're still using that. So I was county administrator for Benzie County at the time, and in 2000, the Bureau of Land Management put out feelers for who would be interested in taking over ownership. So Benzie County decided to do that, had a 3-year process, which consisted of a feasibility study and knowing how we operate and fund a lighthouse, which we had no clue at the time. And in that feasibility study, a timeline was put together, plus priorities of what should be accomplished. Leaving this slide on the screen right now because I want to show you the buildings. Here we have the lighthouse on the right side. There you go. And we have 3 other historic buildings. A little red building next to that is a storage building. That's historic. And then the red building at the bottom there, that's the fog signal building. And then right next to the fog signal building is a little red building, a metal building called the oil storage building. Those 4 are historic buildings. The priority was to restore those buildings first, both exterior and interior. That new building you have on the left there with the cars around it, that it was built in 2014. That replaced a non-historic garage and is used currently for a museum, gift shop, and restrooms for the public. So the larger picture here then is you have the road accessing the lighthouse in the back, and you have the shoreline protection system on the right front. Good a view of that panorama from the south, wrapping around on the north, and then the east where you see the rock revetment. So the road end was a priority because it was sand and hadn't been updated in since the early 1940s. And then the shoreline protection system was considered the fifth priority. But so in that feasibility study, we also had an analysis done of the shoreline protection system by a marine engineer, and they considered it deteriorating and had some suggestions for its improvement. So after ownership was transferred to Benzie County in 2004, first thing we did was do a historic structures report, and that was done by a historic architect out of Ann Arbor, and it mainly addressed the buildings and like the driveway area and the road end to a little extent, but not much. And then they didn't have the expertise to do a historic structures report on the shoreline protection system. And moving forward to today, we're now having that done. So now I want to shift back to when the lighthouse was built. Or the next slide. Well, let's go through the other little pictures of Point Betsy, Mallory. Next, the next couple of slides. So that's a view from the south. We use that for advertising, kind of the traditional picture. A view from the north, when the lilacs are out, just a beautiful picture, also advertising. And the third one is a view from the west. Go ahead, there you go. And that shows a bit of the shoreline protection system as well. And then I think we have a couple other slides, Mallory, of the shoreline. There you go. These are recent shots of the shoreline protection system taken over the last couple of years. So I think there are 3 of these, and we use that in our RFP for the historic structures report. I think there's one more. Okay, now we go to historic. So I want to go back to 1858. The lighthouse was built, and that's a view of it on the left screen there. And when I first saw this picture some 20 years ago, I said, are you kidding me? Is that the same lighthouse we're talking about? As you can see on the difference between the one on the left and the one on the right. So originally it was just a different looking, which it was half the size it is now. The tower is the same. The roof has changed. It was yellow Milwaukee cream brick. And again, in 1858, that was built. This picture says circa 1883, that's probably somewhere between 1865 and 1890 when these pictures were taken of that lighthouse, because it was renovated to its current configuration, as you see on the right, in 1894. But what's significant about that picture on the left is you see kind of an apron there. We thought that apron came in the late 1860s, some like 1865, that time frame. But the current engineer firm thought it may have come in a little later, like around 1890. So there's a big window there. We're not quite sure when that came in. But the reason that they had to do that is they thought the front end of the tower was being undermined. So they put in, and when this was constructed in that time frame, they put in a 4-foot deep cement ring around that tower to solidify the base of it. Then they put the apron in, and the wall there, the break wall, was consisted of timbers at that time. And you'll kind of see that on some of these subsequent pictures. So Mallory, let's go to the next set of pictures here. Well, maybe we should go back to that one on the right. I think that may have shown that a little better. You can see where those guys are standing there. You can see that a little bit there. But the front end was kind of wooden timbers at the time. So let's go ahead, and that's 1910 time frame, and it stayed in this way. So we'll just go to these other historic pictures so people get a panorama. You can see some of the buildings at that time. Some of those were removed in subsequent years. So the 4 remain. The fog signal building, that's what we restored it to on the right side. So let's take a look at a couple more of these. You can see some of the shoreline there. So over the years, again, in the late 1800s, 1890, it started deteriorating. Wasn't holding up. So let's take a look at the next couple there, Mallory. It was being undermined again, and not the lighthouse, but the edge of the protection system. So a firm, the Coast Guard, contracted with a marine firm to rehabilitate the shoreline protection system. And what they put in was a new apron and what you see today, the new apron, the cement blocks on top of that apron, the 2 bulkheads, and well, there were groins that were in the initial plan, but they came in a little bit later in sequence. And then in the 70s, the rock revetment that you saw in that earlier picture came in. So let's take a look at a couple more of these. Okay, that's good. So you can see the picture on the right there, that's its current condition. And you can see the groins, there's 7 of those that were put in over like the period of the 50s and the 60s. So then that was what we call the 1944 upgrade. And again, 4 components, the groins, the apron, the bulkheads, the 2 bulkheads, and the revetment. So a shoreline protection system is not a wall, it's made up of a number of things. So shifting now to the current day, and now I think we're going to go to the drone shots there, Mally. We needed to address this, and we've contracted the county and the Friends with an engineer firm out of Madison, Wisconsin. And they are to do a historic structures report on this, as required by the State Historic Preservation Office, required by the Corps of Engineers. So they came out, they started their work, they came out and did a first drawing shot in March, late March of this year. And you can see there's still snow here. Not a whole lot. In previous years, it's been worse. You can see the water level just almost at the top of the groins. And the groins are, we'll get some other shots there. That third one up there is deteriorated where the front end's missing. And so they started their work on that. You know, people think, well, okay, is the lighthouse in peril of falling into the lake? Well, the answer to that is no. The structure, even though over 75 years old, is still serviceable, still serving its purpose. However, it is at the end of its service life. So we've asked them to do what we could, engineers to do what we are plan out of what we consider another 75-year fix on this. So they've done their study, their 75% study. They have a plan, which we'll cover here in a second. And then we're going to look at options. In fact, we have a call with them tomorrow about what we can do. What they're recommending is because of the higher water, and again, they're going over a series of 50-year averages and so on, highs and lows. They're looking at raising the edge of that apron on the left side there about 4 feet. Now again, 5-6 years ago, we had low water. And some people think that we'll have low water, but we're not having low water. So they're going to then extend that out, put a new bulkhead there on the right side and tie that in. They're going to re-pour the apron. And what they want to do, because if you look at the lighthouse now, although kind of concerned about the lighthouse being affected, it's really the north end where the rocks are that is eaten into the area considerably, the ground mass. And when we get to that point on these drone shots, you'll see that there's like a little harbor in there, which didn't used to be there like 50, 60, 70 years ago. But in any event, so there's what they want to do is pour an apron all the way around, wrap around the fog signal building, and then tie into the north end or the east end of the north side. And then put better rock on that north side than what you're seeing there, what they have currently in place. So the issue with all that is, well, how much is this going to cost? And their initial estimate is like $5 to $9 million for this to take place. So we're going to the second one. I think let's skip this one, Mallory, and go to the next one if we can do that. This is still a March. So that's quite a price tag. And so we're going to address options tomorrow to see what we can do. And we'll take a look at maybe some interim fixes. These groins that you see here, they're going to be removed. They're no longer effective, and they would not be permitted by the Corps of Engineers either. And this, we're wrapping around to the north end now where that guy's standing. That's really a deteriorated area. They're going to have, that's going to be apron. Then as we're wrapping around to the north here and turning east, you see that little area, it looks like a little harbor. That all used to be straight across. In fact, a couple of years ago, the water had receded and it was straight across, and then it went back out again. So now you see this bulkhead going along to the east, and that rock in there, and you can see the deterioration in the land mass. So that needs to be addressed at some point. It's certainly away from the lighthouse, but it's eaten into the area. Up on the right side there, you'll see kind of a square cylinder, or square cement platform. That was where the old AM radio tower base was. There's 3 of those on that side, 3 on the east side, and the one on the east side have all fallen into the water over the last 30, 40 years. But those are still intact there. On the right side, we hope to put up a cell tower there eventually. So being on the National Historic Register or National Register of Historic Places, you have to go through the process. You have to have a historic structures report. This is required by the State Historic Preservation Office, also required by the Corps of Engineers. And then you have that report reviewed by those agencies, and also the EGLE, which is the old Department of Environmental Quality in Michigan. So once they approve that, or modify it in some way, or suggest changes, and a final product is completed, then the engineers can go into a final plan and specification process where they will put together the exact plans for what the new shoreline protection system would be. And then, and again, with a price tag, it may be split into parts, addressing maybe the most serious areas first, or maybe addressing some of the areas most affecting the lighthouse. Again, the lighthouse is not in danger of falling into Lake Michigan. Its protection though is at the end of its life cycle, and rightfully so after 75 years. And it's all part of keeping up this historic Point Betsy Light Station. We addressed all of these issues, and it costs money, and it takes time, and the planning takes time. So that's what I have, Mallory. Continue on looking at this. There's good shots of it.
Yeah, so we have about a minute left in the drone chat, which is pretty phenomenal. I'm enjoying watching. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to type into the Q&A, I think we'll head over to there, head over to questions.
That guy is on the engineer team, so that's.
Getting his 15 minutes of fame on his drone chat. Excellent. All right. Well, Wayne, if you want to join us again with video and audio, we'll jump right into the Q&A. All right. I know I have some questions. So we have a question. So the shore shots of the shore shots, I assume, of the lighthouse indicate that weather brings the drift inland. Has water been at the base of the lighthouse tower?
No, what happens is that it hits that bulkhead and goes straight up in the air, and then lands on the apron about halfway down. And I've never seen any water up near the base of the tower. The apron's like in 3 separate sections. I'd say maybe half to a third of that is hit by water. In the wintertime, when it freezes over, you might get 6-8 feet of ice in that area. That's why you see some of that broken up in some of those shots. That's the area that's most affected. However, I can tell you by standing in the parking lot on the north end, when the waves come in from that end, sometimes you get spray 50 feet inland. So, and then, yeah, spray does come from the west too, but you're not seeing standing water or even high water near the lighthouse base.
Excellent, thank you. So where would, a question on funding. So where is the 8 to 9 million needed to redo the shoreline protection system come from? Where are the possible sources that you're looking at?
Well, it could come from a number of areas. It could be grants. When I talked to the Bureau of Land Management a number of years ago, like 5, they said they have certain grants for such projects. They may be kind of dried up now, doing other things. Need to look at that a little more detail. You could talk about bonding out the project. We have some private donations. We have over $1 million currently in the bank for this project. That's why we could kind of phase it in. And that's probably about it.
But phasing is rehab or investing in historic properties. That's the key word in many of these large projects, the phasing aspect of it. Has there, another one for you, Chuck, has there been an archaeological survey conducted at the Point Betsy Lighthouse?
SHPO has a thing called Section 106. So whenever you do a improvement, like one of the buildings or any kind of a change to the property, SHPO has to come in and do or reaffirm a Section 106, which is an archaeological review. And we've had that done about 3 or 4 times now, but SHPO handles that.
Is the Coast Guard still, so to be clear, the Point Betsy Lighthouse is on Lake Michigan. So when I realized that orienting our attendees, so we were looking mostly east. So the north, as Chuck was saying, you know, is where the erosion was happening, and then the south. So the water is to the west. But if the Coast Guard is still using the light, would they be able to pay for some of the investments?
Well, that's another thing. We've reached out to them, or at least the engineers have. I suspect they will not because it's not affecting them. They don't think it is, and they wanted to relinquish it because they couldn't pay for it. It's upkeep. But we're gonna reach out to them anyway out of the Cleveland office and see if they can do anything. Because even not all of this is on county property now. Some of this on the north end is on Coast Guard property, as they retain the lot to the north, to the east of Point Betsy. So yeah, that's another option I failed to mention. Now, it's an active light, so the Coast Guard comes once a year to change the light bulbs, and it automatically comes on when dark hits and daylight. It goes off, and there's 8 bulbs in there, and one burns out, the next one pops in. So they don't have a lot to do there other than just make sure it's working fine. So they have an easement to the tower. They don't have access to the building, but they have the rights to go in there and take care of that.
Excellent. Wayne, a question for you. Can you metal detect on the shore of the Great Lakes?
A lot of that depends on exactly where you are. And so if you're above the high water mark and you're on your private property or you have permission from the property owner, then yes. If you're below the ordinary high water mark, then you're technically on state bottomlands. And in most cases, I guess that would be a no. If you're in state parks, if you're in a national seashore, things like that, then no. So it really just depends on exactly where you are.
Thank you. I'm going back over to Chuck. Does SHPO have to approve all the work done at Point Betsy, even though it's not a state-owned building.
Yes,
According to our lighthouse
they're,
program.
on the buildings, the restoration, they were really delegated for approval by the Bureau of Land Management. For anything that happens there, the State Historic Preservation Office has to approve it. As far as the shoreline protection system, they're less concerned about that. So the Army Corps of Engineers are the ones that have to approve that one, the main people, as well as Eagle. And SHPO just wants to make sure we're covering all the bases. That's why they're interested in having an HSR.
And does SHPO have an easement on the lighthouse?
No, and I will say though, SHPO, going back to the previous question, they want to make sure the viewscape is historic. So if we came up with an odd plan that again raised the elevation of the apron 4 feet, they're going to want to weigh in on that. I don't think that'll be a problem, because when you're looking at traditional views, it's not really affected any change to the SPS. But again, they'll have an interest in that, as they have with the road end project.
And now SHPO does have a lighthouse grant program for those of you who have ever purchased our Save Our Lights license plate. That goes towards a grant program that SHPO oversees that goes towards rehabilitating lighthouses around the state. Is that something that you guys have ever thought about for Point Betsy?
We've actually used that 6 times.
Okay.
Starting with the feasibility study and the oil storage building, exterior renovation. And I tried to match up about 3 of them to help with the interior, because interior cost was considerable. Then they changed the rules on that, so because of me. And the problem with the SHPO grants is that what's called MLAP grants, Michigan Lighthouse Assistance Program grants, is that the max is $60,000, which is a $40,000 grant and a $20,000 match. So when you're talking about $1 million project, you can't really use a lot of that. You can't tie that together. You can maybe try, but they're more for things like painting a building or some kind of minor project that can handle that. So we use that effectively, but not for something like a shoreline protection system. We're looking for $500 to $1 million grants if we can get them.
Okay. But if you're interested in supporting lighthouses, definitely get your Save Our Lights license plate next time you're up for a renewal. So Wayne, with the rising lake levels, how do you determine the ordinary high water mark? How do you look at that as an archaeologist?
Well, that's a good question. So that's defined already, and I think it's about maxed out. And so pretty much everything that's in the water now is state bottomlands, and this is just about, I think the lake levels currently are right at the ordinary high water mark. And so that's pretty evident where there used to be beautiful sand beaches around the Lake Huron shoreline, and they're all inundated now. The water's right up into people's yards and tree lines and that sort of thing. So it's defined for each of the lakes. I don't know those specific numbers. I think it's like 587.2 feet for Lake Huron or something thereabouts. And so you can see that on charts. You can see that on deeds and other things.
And Wayne, could you talk at all about any legal protection for our shoreline archaeological resources? Is there any, what does that look like as people go in?
So if you have a shipwreck on the beach, it's not just a free-for-all. You're not allowed to go and just take it or take parts of it or cut it up or anything like that. And generally, and this has been the case in the past, when History, Arts, and Libraries was still a department with the state, large chunks of wreckage would come up on various places along the Lake Michigan shore, and their removal was requested by property owners, and that had to go through a state permit. So they had to get a permit through then the DEQ, and the Office of the State Archaeologist to move them. So anything right now on state bottomlands belongs to the state of Michigan, belongs to the people of the state of Michigan, and cannot be removed or recovered without a permit.
Okay, so don't look,
Yeah, just
document,
look, don't take,
report,
enjoy,
don't take
yeah.
it.
It's a great opportunity to see literally pieces of history in front of you. Some people fear that it could be a tripping hazard or there are spikes in it that somebody's going to step on. But really, it's just a way of kind of approaching that artifact and thinking about it as a unique historic object that you have a little bit of stewardship, a sense of stewardship, so you can help protect it, you can help record the information from it.
Going back briefly to your last answer, who issues the permit?
The permits are issued through the Department of Eagle. What used to be the Department of Environmental Quality is now Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And ultimately, they issue the permits because they're related to cultural resources. They would get pushed over to the state archaeologist and for review and signature. So it's sort of a joint permit.
All right. Now, for those people who see an object and they document it, and we will, in our follow-up email with a link to the recording, we'll be sharing that document with attendees, so you can print those out. Next time you go to the beach, just put them in your bag and have it ready to go. So when people send you that information, is there like a database online that people can go and look at some of this stuff? Or is there a way to see previously documented shipwrecks or archaeological finds?
There is not yet, but if you request that information, I can let you know, oh yeah, we saw this plank or what appears to be the same plank, and it was a mile down the shore from where you're reporting it currently. It was reported, a mile away 2 months ago, that sort of thing. So I do maintain a database for all of these pieces and parts, and as you can imagine, it gets pretty extensive. And then that is shared with Stacy Trzynski and her office. And again, if it warrants the next step, which is the full on-site recording of a particular object or a group of objects, then we bring that up to the next step, and that goes into the archaeological site file. So yeah, it's in a database, and certainly I'd be happy to share information about other things in that vicinity.
And so with collecting this data, like what do you do with it? I mean, are you tracking objects, trying to find wrecks? I mean, how does this help you as the state maritime archaeologist?
Yeah, it does a little bit of both. It's kind of fun to just sort of track how the cultural materials interact with the environment. And again, something that may be on the beach today, 1.5 miles north of Ludington, for example, 10 years from now, may be 3 miles to the south of Ludington. They're very transient. Again, you're looking at a snapshot in time. And so it's very interesting to see the dynamics of the natural processes on these kinds of materials. It also helps us to see the conditions of those materials and their widespread distribution. And you can start to see patterns perhaps in how artifacts are kind of related to a primary wreck that's offshore there. You can make some guesses sometimes based on the location and the types of materials, the identification of that specific shipwreck or vessel. Yeah, so it's all good, and it really just starts with the recording of it.
Excellent. Thank you. And yes, we have 3,288 miles of coastline, so that's a lot to be monitoring as just yourself. So I hope some people will take advantage of this information. About how many contacts a week do you get about coastal resources, Wayne?
It always comes in cycles. It seems like that I may not get a phone call or an email or a text for several months, and then all of a sudden I'm getting 15 a day. And so it just seems to kind of wax and wane like that. And I think a lot of that depends on the conditions that are going on around the lake. Good weather brings people out for the first time, particularly in the early spring, end of winter, when the ice breaks and the snow disappears. all of a sudden there's usually a lot of materials that are just kind of there and visible for the first time. So it sort of goes depending on the weather and the climate and what else is going on. In recent weeks, I only got a couple of reports of things, and they were duplicates of materials that I had already heard about. But most of the reporting came kind of early on with in conjunction with the pandemic. I think a lot of people were home or were walking the beaches or getting a little stir crazy or whatnot. And so there were a lot more eyes on the water, and consequently there were a lot of reports then.
Okay, excellent. So it is 2 o'clock. Thank you both. I think that's all of the questions. Chuck has done a wonderful job. So with the Lighthouse programs, SHPO doesn't have an easement on the property, but as Chuck has said several times, like he is in contact with SHPO and they do review all of the work done at the Lighthouse. And so as it sounds like they're having a meeting later this afternoon to start planning for the future. So I'm sure those ideas and plans will be going before SHPO, which is pretty exciting. Now, Chuck, you have documented that shoreline protection system extensively through this report. Is there any historic aspects of the protection system that will be able to remain, or is that going to have to be a conversation?
Well, they're going to take the apron off and put a new one on top of it. It's not really historic. The bulkheads will probably stay there. Again, they're historic to some extent, but I think it's more of a rehabilitation than it is a restoration effort. And Brian, I see that he was there, so he wasn't too concerned about restoring it so much as making it work right in the future.
All right. Well, thank you both for your time and sharing your experiences and working so hard to protect our cultural resources on the shore. And thank you all for attending today. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email myself, Mallory Bauer, with the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. And I'll be sending out another email with the recording once we have it processed and that form, so you can get out there and start documenting anything that you find on the beach. We hope to see you at our future webinar. We're still working to try to get something in July, but we do have webinars planned in August and September. So we hope to see you there. Again, check out our website at www.mhpn.org or check us out on social media. We're the most active on Facebook. So thank you, Wayne and Chuck, again for your time. And we look forward to seeing you all in the future.
Thank you, Mallory.
Thank you. Appreciate it.